Hello, in this video I'd like to talk about Socrates mostly, but before I do that I want to talk to you a little bit about three people that it's very important that you know about. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. They're all related to each other. Socrates comes first, he's a teacher, Plato is his student, and Aristotle is Plato's student. I'll talk about each of them in turn. So this video is going to be about Socrates mostly. Socrates was a teacher, as I said, who lived in Athens about 400 BCE. He, in his youth, was a stonecutter. He was also a soldier. He was a father, although notoriously not a very good one, not a very good husband either. But in his retirement, he became kind of an unpaid teacher. In those days, it was common for the youth of a polis or city-state like Athens, where Socrates taught, to follow around a master, to learn things like rhetoric and elocution. Socrates is described repeatedly as the gadfly of the state. Gadfly is kind of like a horsefly. And if you've ever seen a horse quietly grazing in a field suddenly bolt because it's been stung or bitten by a horsefly, you kind of get the picture. Socrates saw himself as doing that with the citizens of Athens. He saw himself as irritating people into the pursuit of goodness. There are a lot of things that are named after Socrates. The Socratic method, which I'll get to in a minute, but also the Socratic paradox. Before Socrates retired, he and a friend went to the oracle at Delphi. An oracle was basically a priestess who people went to ask questions to, kind of like a fortune teller. And usually the answer that came back would be like a riddle. You rarely got a straight answer, because that way you couldn't really be held to, you know, what it was that you said. But at any rate, Socrates' friend asks, "Is there anyone wiser than Socrates?" And the oracle answers, "No, there is no one wiser than Socrates." And this surprises Socrates a great deal because he thinks he doesn't know anything. This sets up that Socratic paradox. And it also sets up the idea of Socrates being the gadfly of the state, because what he does is to test the prediction of the oracle. He goes around and he finds the wisest, most respected people in Athens, and he begins to ask them questions to test their wisdom on subject areas that they should be specialists in. And what he finds is they're not really very wise at all. So therein is the paradox. In thinking that they are wise, they are ignorant. And in Socrates, in knowing that he is ignorant, he is the most wise. I mentioned the Socratic method. In the Socratic method, a question is used to break down sort of previous assumptions, to distill knowledge, to get to the heart of the matter. It's a little bit like our scientific method today, with hypothesis being the first part of it. The Socratic method is even a method of teaching. It goes a little bit like this. The teacher comes into the room and says, "Who is Socrates?" And the student puts up his hand and says, "A Greek philosopher." And then the teacher says, "Is that all?" And then somebody else puts up their hand and says, "Well, he was the gadfly of Athens," and so on and so on, until you get to a fuller picture of who Socrates was. Forces people to question their own beliefs. in speaking of the beliefs of Socrates, it's very difficult to get at exactly what he believed, because so much of what we have of Socrates is from the writings of his student, Plato. Remember I was talking in an earlier video about how philosophy was the written word? Well, Socrates didn't write anything. Plato, his devoted student, wrote down everything that Socrates said, or claimed to have written down everything that Socrates said, oftentimes years after the fact. So what we have really is a kind of hybrid Socrates-Plato, kind of a Platocrates or a Socrato. But there are some things that are a little bit distinct in the terms of what it was exactly that Socrates believed in. Socrates was interested in the good, and justice. He believed that wrongdoing was a consequence of ignorance. He was a lover of wisdom. In fact, that's where the word philosophy comes from, love of wisdom. He believed that moral excellence was the result of divine bequest, meaning that we're born with as who we are. Some people say that's part of the reason why he wasn't that interested in his own sons. And he believed in the pursuit of virtue, by which he meant working to perfect your own soul through becoming wiser, was greater than getting material wealth. One of Socrates' most famous quotes was, "What I do not know, I do not think I know." Socrates was unfortunate to live in a politically turbulent time in Athens. The Peloponnesian War had just ended, and in that war, Sparta, which was a very militaristic polis, basically humiliated Athens. And the Athenians were looking around at each other, and they were trying to decide what to do about that. How were they going to react to that? And, perhaps not surprisingly, they came up with this idea that might meant right. Now, Socrates didn't really agree with that, and he started to ask questions and demonstrate that some very powerful people hadn't thought their way through things. And in the end, he was accused of corrupting the youth of Athens, which is to say, teaching them wrong things, and of impiety, which meant not believing in the gods, the patron gods of Athens. Socrates' trial is something of a circus. He's on trial for his life. I mean, the penalty for those things is death. But he doesn't seem to take it very seriously. Instead, he harangues the jurors. He accuses them of being wrong-headed, of being concerned with the wrong things. In the end of the trial, he's asked to suggest his own punishment. And the punishment he suggests is a pension and free meals for the rest of his life. So you can imagine how that went over. The Athenians sentenced him to death by drinking a mixture of poison, which includes hemlock. You often hear that referred to in other things, drinking hemlock. That's Socrates taking this poisonous drink to kill himself, which he does do. As he's dying, we know from people who were in the room with him, his students mostly, he begins to go numb from the feet up, and his last words are to one of his students, Crito, and he says to him, "We owe a rooster to Acephalus. Please see that the debt is paid." And what that means is Acephalus was the Greek god of healing, and Socrates is saying that his death, his leaving this mortal world, is a form of being healed. What Socrates is saying is that his death is a form of being healed from the distractions and irrelevancies of this life. That's kind of an important idea. It comes up later in Plato. Socrates could have escaped. His students were pretty wealthy, and they had bribed the guards. In some accounts, they had a boat waiting to take him away. But he refused to go. He said that doing so would have broke his social contract with Athens. And it would have meant that all this big talk he had done about justice really didn't mean that much when it came down to it, in that he was given a trial and sentenced to death. In the end, Socrates dies. He becomes a martyr to philosophy. He dies for what he sees as the philosophical ideal. And that so inspires his student Plato, that Plato devotes himself, the rest of his life, to discussing Socrates, to, in effect, preaching Socrates' wisdom, and developing his own school of thought based on Socrates' wisdom.